government of the United Kingdom is a constitutional monarchy led by a prime minister and their cabinet, the prime minister attaining their position through the primacy of their party in the country's key legislation-passing body, its parliament. So the prime minister runs day-to-day operations in the country. They are technically appointed by the monarch, who is currently Charles III as of 2022, though that appointment is generally determined by other factors, like who has the most support within Parliament, the most seats held by their party, and in many cases seats held by allies and allies of convenience as well. When this happens, the resulting government is called a coalition government, because while the prime minister is from one party, usually the one with the most seated MPs, members of Parliament, they are only able to govern because they have one or more other parties working with them as part of a coalition. Now, the UK government has two houses in its parliament, the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and the names of these houses tell you a lot about them. The House of Lords consists of folks who have been granted lordships by government higher-ups, alongside those who have inherited lordships from their parents, but it also includes experts in various fields who have been granted that status by the Prime Minister, economists, for instance. The House of Commons, in contrast, is voted upon by the people. So when there are parliamentary elections in the UK, that's what we're talking about. Votes for MPs who represent a region, a parliamentary constituency, of which there are 650 across the UK's constituent countries, England, Scotland, Wales, and North Ireland. Within the UK, political parties have to be officially registered to participate in governance and votes, though folks who want to run solo can register as independent or label-less candidates for voting purposes. As of late May 2024, there were 393 officially registered political parties in the UK, though only 13 of them currently have representatives in the House of Commons, and only 4 of those have more than 10 seated representatives. The Conservative and Unionist Party, often called the Tories or Conservatives, the Labour Party, which is the main centre-left party in the UK, the Scottish National Party, which is also generally centre-left but tends to focus on Scottish politics and priorities, and the Liberal Democrats, who are generally seen as a sort of blend of the Tories and Labour. General elections, during which MPs are voted upon, are held every 5 years or so, but elections can also be held sooner if the current Prime Minister asks the monarch to dissolve Parliament, which in practice means the Prime Minister is calling for a general election, generally scheduled for a specific date in the future, usually because the House of Commons has lost faith in the current government, which makes passing law and overall getting things done difficult. They don't have enough votes to pass anything, basically, though in some cases it's because of more general political circumstances that indicate calling for an election now might be better than holding an election sometime later in the future. That latter case seems to be the impetus for what I'd like to talk about today, which is the recently called and now upcoming UK general election, and the state of political play in this, one of the world's wealthiest and most influential countries. You're listening to Let's Know Things. I'm Colin Wright. Learn more about Let's Know Things, subscribe to receive free email updates, and or become a supporter to receive monthly bonus episodes at letsknowthings.com. On May 22nd, UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak announced that he was calling for a snap election on July 4th of this year, just a half dozen weeks in the future, surprising many analysts who expected he would wait as long as possible before committing to a date. That expectation was predicated on the reality of how Sunak's party, the Tories, have been doing in the polls in recent years, pretty abysmally. Labour has been crushing the Tories, the Conservatives, in these polls of late. The Tories have been in power since 2010, which means purely by virtue of having been governing that long, a lot of people will tend to blame them for a lot of things, their party having been in charge all that time. But they also catalyzed and oversaw the secession of the UK from the European Union, which is a move that was initially pushed by many on the further right wing of their party. but the populist nature of the movement eventually claimed the majority of Tory politicians who changed their vote to support it, rewiring politics in the UK, similar to how former President Trump rewired the Republican Party in the United States. A lot of power changing hands, a lot of previously top people being elbowed aside or pushed into retirement, a lot of new policies ascending to the front burner, while previous priorities were relegated to the back burner. Not quite a decade after the referendum that led to the passage of Brexit, back in mid-2016, polls from this month, May of 2024, show that 55% of British people think leaving the EU was the wrong choice, while only 31% think it was a smart move. So while some of the tarnishing of the Tory party's reputation is likely the result of simply having been in power for a long time, and having been in power during some really unusual global happenings, like COVID and the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, some of it is directly attributable to specific things they've done, which turned out to be not very popular once implemented. Many of the non-Brexit complaints the majority of British citizens have about how the Tories have governed are related to their austerity policies, the idea that they need to shrink the government and its spending as much as possible, because that will, according to their theories at least, make the country wealthier and more efficient and more secure. This has led to dramatic cutbacks on incredibly popular programs and agencies focused on and related to health and housing and education, among others, alongside the bankrupting of civil services, the privatization of previously public assets like highways and waste systems, and the concomitant spending, while claiming there's not enough money for healthcare and public services, on pet projects for conservative lawmakers and their constituents, many of which ended up being money pits. All parties in all countries are, of course, periodically staggered by bad choices and scandals, spending-related and otherwise, but over their long period in control, the Tories have racked up a huge number and a large variety of scandals, and some of them led to very public embarrassments for the party, including the Tories' seeming inability to keep a prime minister in office following the Brexit referendum. Then Prime Minister David Cameron making way for Theresa May, who handed things over to Boris Johnson, who was ousted and replaced by Liz Truss, who was Prime Minister for a record-setting 49 days before resigning and being replaced by current Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. That is 5 Prime Ministers in the 6 years between 2016 and 2022, all of them from the same party, that party seemingly unable to govern with enough popularity to maintain the confidence of Parliament. So the situation right now, following all of that, is that Labour has a 17-point lead over the Conservatives, and is, and has been for a while, broadly expected to just wipe the floor with the Tories in the next election. And a few minor elections leading up to this point seem to support that assumption. This is why Sunak was expected to delay scheduling the next election for as long as possible, because as soon as that election is held, his party is expected to be pushed out of power, and that expectation is leading to an exodus amongst Tory lawmakers, 121 of them so far stepping down instead of running for re-election as of late May, surpassing a similar wave of quitting in 1997 when 117 of them declined to run again, leading up to a landslide victory for the Labour Party and their popular leader, Tony Blair. This is not an unusual phenomenon. Being part of the government is very different from being part of the opposition party. And back in 2010, after Labour had been in control for 13 years and was expected to lose in the next election, 149 politicians decided to step down rather than running again. 100 of them Labour MPs, and 35 of them Conservatives. That latter group, ostensibly because while the Tories were expected to win, they did not take a majority, and they had to form a coalition with the Liberal Democrats, which is also a very different situation from being in a government that has complete control, rather than shared control. Some MPs just don't want to deal with that kind of coalition-related negotiated leadership. Sunak's reasoning here, then, might be that while things are bad for his party now, they could get even worse if he waits to hold an election. So it is better to act at a moment in which some economic numbers are actually starting to look a little bit better after a long period of the opposite, and at a moment in which announcing an election would catch his Labour opposition off guard, possibly providing his party the benefit of surprise and slightly better preparation. This announcement has led to a scramble, though, for all UK parties, seemingly, to try to get some actual governing done. Work that they thought they would have several more weeks to finish up at least before going into full campaign mode suddenly needs to be accomplished yesterday. That's meant a lot of important legislation has been dropped or permanently backburnered, including some of the policies like a smoking ban, an end to no-fault evictions, and a plan that would allow the government to ship asylum seekers to Rwanda, which Sunak had wanted to serve as fundamental elements of his prime ministerial legacy. Even those have now been completely dropped. This has led to a situation in which the Tories seem to be scrambling to put new ideas out into the ether, future-facing stuff to replace all the things that they had to drop or backtrack on, hoping that something they propose in this way will appeal broadly enough to earn them the votes they require to hold their own in the upcoming election, to maybe still lose, but not as much, and in such a way that they're in a good spot to win when the next election is called. One such idea is mandatory national service for 18-year-olds, which would require that folks either serve in the military or volunteer for 1 weekend a month, beginning on their 18th year. A policy that is reportedly meant to compete with a proposal from Labour leader Keir Starmer that 16 and 17-year-olds should be able to vote. The degree to which any of these new plans will catch the public's imagination is up in the air, though, as, again, a lot of what's happening now in terms of campaigning is somewhat half-baked, all involved parties scrambling to prepare for what seems to have been a somewhat last-minute decision on Sunak's part to upend expectations about the timing of the next election in order to attain some kind of surprise advantage for his party, which seems to be entering this round with a losing hand. And all of this is important, of course, if you live in the UK, but it's also important globally, even standing out amongst the many other important elections that are occurring around the world this year, because the UK, even battered and bruised in the aftermath of Brexit and a COVID crisis that it weathered somewhat less well than its world-leading peers, is still an incredibly powerful, influential, and wealthy entity of global significance. It has the 6th largest economy in the world after only the US, China, Japan, Germany, and India. It's incredibly powerful geopolitically, out of proportion with its population and military strength, in part because of the role it plays within the Commonwealth, a group of 53 nations that the UK previously ruled, and in part because it has long-lived, tight alliances and relationships with governments and other entities that it has been maintaining, in some cases, for centuries. The UK is a nuclear power, and it is the 7th largest exporter of arms in the world, though it's especially vital to the global aircraft market, military and non-military. The UK is home to the 2nd largest financial center in the world, London, and it is culturally very powerful, exporting all sorts of norms and pop culture and creative products, a sort of soft power that plays a huge role in beliefs and behaviors and understandings worldwide. Whomever wins this election, then, and how they win and to what degree they control Parliament will have a major impact, not just on the UK, but on the world. And at a moment in which there are several major military conflicts ongoing, in which new technologies are simultaneously threatening and enlivening entire industries and economies, and in which the global order that has set the tone and guardrails for the world since World War II is being challenged. All variables the UK may influence in substantial ways, and over which the folks running the government will thus have outsized sway. The book I'd like to recommend today is called Like Literally, Dude, Arguing for the Good in Bad English by Valerie Fridland. This is a book about the evolution of language, about the gray zones between good and bad grammar and use of language, about how there's good to be found in even things that are generally considered to be bad aspects and uses of language, and about how it makes more sense in most cases to celebrate these evolutions and experiments and to be interested in them rather than becoming a pedant and poo-pooing them outright, deciding that they are incorrect and okay, or just annoying, as opposed to being indications of some subtle change in how language is iterating in certain groups and on certain mediums and in certain contexts. And it basically provides a solid argument for why we should pay more attention to language and allow ourselves to experiment with it, rather than following all the posted signs and staying well within the pre-carved confines of the grammatical standards of our current era. Now, if any of that sounds interesting to you, consider picking up a copy of Like Literally, Dude by Valerie Fridland. You can subscribe to receive email updates, find show notes, and other such content, and support this show financially, receiving additional bonus episodes as a thank you at letsknowthings.com. Learn more about me and my work at Colin.io. Subscribe to my other news-focused podcast, One Sentence News, wherever you get your pods, or at onesentencenews.com. And say howdy on social media. I'm at Colin is my name on Instagram and Twitter, and Colin Wright on Facebook and YouTube. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Colin Wright, and I'll talk to you again next week.